All right, Kyle. So it was just a couple weeks ago that we talked about conference realignment in college football. The ACC has expanded yet again. We're going to see Cal, Stanford, and SMU join the conference. So again, the weirdness of having two teams on the Pacific Coast playing in the Atlantic Coast Conference. We have to revisit that conversation. Now, I know you know the TV deals and the money and all that stuff a little bit better than I do, so care to explain?
Oh, I want to say it was back in the week after the Pac-12 jettisoned all their teams out. So like that 24 hours where Oregon and Washington jumped to the Big Ten, and then Arizona and Arizona State and Utah jumped over to the Big 12, and then it left only 4 teams left in the Pac-12. Cal and Stanford looked around and they were like, oh shit, we're screwed. And so they looked around like the Big 12 doesn't want us, the Big 10 doesn't want us. Who wants us? And the only option left on the table was the ACC. The ACC is currently, if you haven't been following, the ACC has a television contract through 2036 with their member schools. Member schools got screwed on that deal because they signed too long a deal to money up front, and then they can't jump conferences because it costs like $400 million to break that contract with the ACC. So while all of the lawyers are trying to figure out how they can break their ACC contract so that Miami can go to the Big Ten and Florida State can maybe go to the SEC, while all of that is going on, you have Cal and Stanford saying, we need a conference, period, because after this season, we have $0 of income coming in at this point. We have nothing on our television deal. We need something from a conference. And so they went to the ACC. They proposed a slightly less of a payout compared to other teams in the conference, and they got voted down. It was 7 yes, 8 no from the ACC. And so Cal and Stanford went back to the drawing board. And what they ended up agreeing to essentially was, we'll take 30% of what the normal payouts are for the ACC television contract. So if that number is, I want to say 35 million, I'm not 100% sure what the payout per year is to school. Cal and Stanford did about 10.5 million of that money. And the other 25 million for each of them, which adds up to 50 million, gets distributed to schools at the top of the income, like the teams that bring in the most money to the conference. So Florida State, Miami, North Carolina, schools that bring in more money to the conference but get equal payouts to like Wake Forest or some shit. Those schools get the extra money that Cal and Stanford are essentially forfeiting as part of their terms of getting into the conference. So they negotiated that deal, got a couple schools to flip, and then they agreed to add them to the ACC. So Cal and Stanford are going to get not a whole lot of money from the deal, but they also get to be in a power conference, even if that is the Atlantic Coast Conference. And then for SMU's sake, SMU just wanted to be in a power conference. SMU ain't getting paid anything from the ACC. They just wanted to be in a power conference really, really badly. And so they're going to give up all of their income from the ACC for the first 7 years. It's a really bad financial deal for SMU, but SMU said, we don't want to be in the AAC anymore, which might not get anything on a television contract coming up on their next deal now that all of their biggest and best schools have left for either the Big 12 or another conference.
Now, you broke it down from the money standpoint, but from a competitive standpoint, obviously Cal, they've been down for the last decade. Stanford has taken a huge step back. SMU, they've been a good mid-major squad, a group of 5 school. I don't think that they're going to necessarily come in and challenge anyone in this conference. We know the top is very much driven by Clemson when it comes to football. What do you think of the ACC's long-term viability? Do you think that their additions will at all change the competitive balance in the conference?
Are we talking about football specific here? Because football specific, I don't think it's going to make a huge difference because Cal football is just awful. Let me just put that out there. Cal football, awful. Not adding very much value. I think $10.5 million per year is too much money for Cal football because Cal football is really, really bad. Stanford is a different conversation because Stanford has proven that they can be really good at football. They've won 3 Rose Bowls in the last decade. I know that's kind of weird to think about, but Stanford has won 3 Rose Bowls in the last 10 years. Christian McCaffrey obviously was the star at Stanford, and David Shaw and Jim Harbaugh built up a program that was consistently a top 10 team. Like the way that we think of Utah now, that was Stanford for much of the 2010s, and Utah holds some level of value. I mean, the Big 12 wanted Utah almost immediately as soon as that possibility was presented. So Stanford, I think, is a different conversation. Also, the fact that Stanford is the most decorated athletic department in all of sports, if you want to expand out beyond football and basketball, which are obviously big money sports. Stanford has more national championships in every sport than any other school in the country. So I think Stanford's a little bit of a different conversation. Obviously, they're not very good at the money-making sports right now, although here comes Trent Taylor, the former head coach at Sac State, to try and revive the Stanford program this year. So Stanford, I think, will add some value to the conference, absolutely. It may not be what the ACC was asking for originally from Stanford, but just adding schools to the conference is good for the ACC because the ACC just needs names at this point, especially as Florida State is like holding up a knife to them and trying to rob them at gunpoint to get out of their television contract because Florida State is really unhappy in the ACC right now.
Okay, so you mentioned Florida State being unhappy. What about the other schools like Clemson? They've been kind of propping up the conference in terms of football for the last couple of years. The University of Miami, while they haven't been widely successful on the football field, they still are a big name nonetheless. How long before these teams get unsatisfied? Again, I understand the contracts lock them in for whatever they lock them in for, but contracts are like hearts. They're made to be broken, right? I feel like if there's a will, there's a way. And these teams, if they are truly unhappy in the ACC, they will find that way.
Yeah, so there's 5 teams right now that are trying to work their way out of the ACC and figure out if they can break their TV contract and join one of the big 2 conferences. Right now, it's Florida State, Miami, North Carolina, NC State, and Clemson are working to try and get out of the ACC. Relatively unsuccessful so far, although they're going through that television contract. They're figuring out if they can generate some kind of leverage, because ultimately that's the case right now. ESPN Disney has like all the leverage in this situation because they've signed the contracts. It's a long-term deal. Disney's content to continue meeting the obligations of their contract, which is to broadcast a certain number of ACC games on national television and to keep the ACC network viable. ESPN's content to keep honoring the contract, and so these schools are kind of trying to figure out where they can find leverage. Yeah, Florida State wants to go to the SEC, Miami wants to go to the Big Ten, and those conferences are receptive to bringing those schools in, so I think it is a matter of time before they try and work their way out, but I think that might be the next round of college football realignment, which is something we talked about on the last video. Once we see how the ACC gets resolved, then we'll know what college football realignment looks like now and what it might look like in 8 to 9 years when this round of television contracts expires and everyone tries to move around and find a new conference or potentially just negotiates into one giant 64-team league. But I don't know how this is going to get resolved for Florida State and Clemson and Miami and the North Carolina schools.
We know that during COVID, Notre Dame worked out something to play in the ACC and make that work to fill out their schedule. Do you think there's a Godfather offer on the table to make Notre Dame? Because as fun as adding Cal, Stanford, and SMU is, I think probably the big player that would really kind of change how people look at the ACC would be adding Notre Dame, honestly.
I don't think it's any different than it was in the past, because the thing that's distinct about Notre Dame is Notre Dame wants to be independent. That is their thing. They want to be independent in football. They negotiate their own television contract with NBC and Peacock to broadcast their games. Now, I think the thing that's different now is that, well, beginning this year, I suppose, because the new television contracts kick in for the Big Ten this year. Beginning this year, Notre Dame's no longer the exclusive NBC partner for college football. You're going to see Big Ten games on NBC beginning this year. The primetime Saturday night slot is going to have Big Ten games on NBC. So that's something that's going to change the equation a little bit for Notre Dame. But I think Notre Dame is going to stick with the situation they're in right now, which is we're going to be ACC for every sport except for football. And we're kind of okay with not getting the football payouts from the conference. I don't think Notre Dame's going to be joining the ACC in football anytime soon.
Playing a hypothetical here, though, if you're the ACC, how do you make a pitch to them above the Big Ten that has a lot of their rivals?
For the Big Ten, because obviously Notre Dame is right in the middle of Big Ten country. It makes all the sense in the world for Notre Dame to join the Big Ten. But I think you would need Florida State and Miami and those schools that would rather leave the ACC and join a power conference to be more cooperative in order to lure Notre Dame over to the conference, potentially sacrificing dollars because the TV contract isn't going to go up by adding Notre Dame. So everyone's going to get a slightly smaller piece of the pie if Notre Dame's going to get college football payouts from the ACC. I think you would need those schools to kind of collaborate there, but I think the ACC's kind of moved past that at this point. And I think the reason you can kind of infer that is look at the ACC just adding Cal and Stanford and SMU to try and appease Florida State and appease Miami and appease Clemson by giving them an extra $50 million to split between the group by Cal and Stanford agreeing to only take 30% payouts and SMU agreeing to take no payouts for the first 7 years of their ACC contract. So I think the directive of the ACC is to try and bring Florida State and Clemson down from the edge a little bit more than it is to try and lure Notre Dame at this point. Because I think if they had wanted to, 2020 was the year to do it. When Notre Dame was desperate to fill out a football schedule, when Notre Dame needed to be a part of the ACC temporarily, I think that was the year for the ACC to do it because they had the most leverage in that situation. At this point, I think they would need some help from those big schools in the conference. I put big in air quotes because Louisville is also technically a big school, but they're content to take their ACC payouts and ignore the fact that they're the worst college basketball team in the conference. So I don't think there's a good chance Notre Dame is going to get there, but I think the path forward would be getting Florida State, Miami, and NC State and North Carolina and Clemson to kind of accept taking slightly less on their payouts in order to bring in a Notre Dame.
All right, guys, the ACC is making moves, adding Cal, Stanford, and SMU. Do any of these teams change the landscape for you of the ACC? Do they elevate the conference at all? I'd like to hear your thoughts in the comment section. Leave a like on the video, subscribe to the channel, follow us on all our social medias from Juju and Kyle. Stay safe, happy, and healthy. We'll see you next time.